Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, has the autumn darkness settled where you are tonight? Perhaps there's lamplight near, a teacup cooling, the faint scratch of pen on paper. These were the hours when Watson learned that old secrets do not sleep. They merely wait to be disturbed. Do subscribe so no mystery passes you by. Now settle in as we turn to a case of misfiled documents and delayed reckoning. For as Holmes knew well, the past leaves traces even time cannot erase. You'll also find us on Spotify. The link is just below in the description. Chapter 1, The House of Careful Silences. It was in the autumn of 1895, during that brief golden interval between the conclusion of the Bruce Partington affair and the onset of the winter months, that I found myself once again in the company of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, responding to a summons of a character so peculiar that even now, with the passage of years, I confess I am not entirely certain what first persuaded Holmes to accept it. The invitation had arrived on a Thursday morning, borne by special messenger, and was composed in a hand of such exquisite copperplate that Holmes remarked upon it before he had read a single word of its contents. The letter itself was brief. Sir Alister Pemberton Vane, a retired clerk of the Lord Chancellor's office and a gentleman of considerable reputation in legal circles, requested Holmes's presence at Ashgrove Grange, his Berkshire estate, on a matter which he could not bring himself to commit fully to paper. There had been no crime, he wrote, nor any immediate threat to person or property. There had been, however, what he described only as a growing sense of dread, certain inexplicable disturbances, and a conviction that he was being watched from within his own walls. The language was restrained to the point of opacity, yet there was something in its very restraint that suggested depths of anxiety the writer could not or would not articulate. Holmes read the letter twice, held it to the light, examined the watermark, and set it upon the breakfast table with a faint expression of interest. I have known my companion long enough to recognise that faint expression. It is the look of a man who has been presented with a puzzle of unusual geometry. We departed for Berkshire the following morning. The journey was uneventful. The countryside passing in the muted colours of early October, the fields lying fallow under a sky of unbroken grey. Holmes spent the greater portion of the journey in silence, smoking his pipe and staring through the carriage window with an abstraction I did not disturb. It was only as we approached the station nearest to Ashgrove that he spoke at all, and then only to remark, in a tone of mild curiosity, that a man who had spent 40 years in the machinery of the law was unlikely to imagine threats where none existed. Ashgrove Grange proved to be a handsome house of moderate size, built in the Georgian style, and approached by a long drive of raked gravel that crunched beneath the wheels of the trap sent to meet us. The setting was one of considerable quietude. The grounds were well kept but restrained, the gardens running to box hedges and gravel walks rather than any profusion of ornament. The house itself stood amid ancient oaks, and as we drew near I observed that the windows were fitted with heavy curtains drawn nearly closed despite the hour of the afternoon. There was in the entire prospect a quality of deliberate stillness, as though the house and its inhabitants had long ago agreed upon the wisdom of making no unnecessary sound. We were received at the door by a manservant of advanced years who conducted us into a drawing-room furnished with deep Persian carpets, locked glass cabinets, and an atmosphere I can only describe as the silence of men who have learned, through long practice, the price of an unguarded word. Sir Alister himself rose to greet us, a tall, spare gentleman of perhaps 65, and is with a scholar's stoop and the careful, deliberate movements of one who has spent a lifetime handling documents of irreplaceable value. He shook hands with both of us, expressed his gratitude for our attendance, and offered refreshment with the formality of a man conducting an interview. Holmes declined the refreshment and requested instead that Sir Alister explain the nature of the disturbances that had prompted his letter. Our host settled into his chair with visible effort, as though preparing to lift a weight of considerable size. He began by stating, with lawyerly precision, that nothing he was about to describe could be said to constitute evidence in any legal sense. There had been letters, he said, anonymous letters, delivered at irregular intervals over the past 6 weeks. They contained no explicit threats, no demands for money, no identifiable grievances. They were composed of nothing more than fragments of old legal language, citations to cases long concluded, references to events of which he had no immediate recollection. They were, he admitted, unnerving precisely because they appeared to signify something he could not identify. Beyond the letters, there had been other disturbances. Papers in his private study had been rearranged during hours when the room was unoccupied. Not disordered, Sir Alister was careful to emphasise, but rearranged, as though someone had examined them and returned them to a sequence not quite their original one. He had tested this by marking the position of certain documents with faint pencil lines upon the blotter beneath them, and on 3 separate occasions the lines no longer corresponded to the edges of the papers. The differences were minute, he said, but they were real. I confess that at this juncture I entertained some doubt as to whether Sir Alister might not be suffering from a species of nervous strain peculiar to men of sedentary and solitary habits. Holmes, however, betrayed no such scepticism. He listened with an attention so complete that it seemed almost physical, his grey eyes fixed upon our host with an intensity I had seldom observed outside the moments immediately preceding an arrest. When Sir Alister had concluded his account, Holmes asked a single question. Had any of the anonymous letters referred, however obliquely, to the year 1873? Sir Alister's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The colour left his face, his hands, and which had been folded in his lap, tightened until the knuckles showed white. He did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said. One of them had. Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed some hypothesis he had already formed, and asked to be introduced to the other members of the household. Sir Alister rose with the air of a man who has delivered himself of a confession and is now prepared to face its consequences. The introductions were conducted in the library, a long oak-panelled room lined from floor to ceiling with legal volumes, chancery records, and the accumulated archives of a professional lifetime. The company assembled there for an extended autumnal visit consisted of 4 persons, each of whom Sir Alister presented with the same careful formality he had employed in describing his troubles. Mr. Crispin Holt was a barrister of the Inner Temple, an old friend of Sir Alister's from their days on the Exeter circuit. He was a florid, corpulent gentleman of perhaps 50, whose bonhomie struck me, even at first acquaintance, as slightly too studied, as though he were performing the part of a jovial companion rather than inhabiting it naturally. He shook hands with vigour, expressed delight at our presence, and immediately offered opinions upon the weather, the excellence of the shooting in the district, and the deplorable state of the railways, none of which Holmes acknowledged beyond the barest civility. Miss Eugenia Pemberton Vane was Sir Alister's niece, an unmarried woman of perhaps 30, who managed the estate's affairs with quiet efficiency. She was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of a composure that reminded me of certain senior nurses I had known during my time in the Army Medical Department, women accustomed to the management of crises without the luxury of visible emotion. She greeted us with a brief, firm handshake and a level gaze that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated, and had long since ceased to concern herself with correcting the impression. The Reverend Octavius Drax was the clergyman of the rural parish, a guest at the Grange by virtue of some old family connection I did not immediately understand. He was a man of middle age, dressed in clerical black, whose piety sat uneasily upon him like a borrowed coat. There was something in his manner, a studied humility combined with an attentiveness to the reactions of others, that put me faintly in mind of those clergymen one occasionally encounters in military hospitals, men who have entered the church less from conviction than from a desire for respectability inadequately furnished by other means. The final member of the company was Mr. Leopold Sars, A continental archivist engaged to catalogue Sir Alister's considerable private library. He was a small, precise man of indeterminate age, with the stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers of his profession. He spoke English with a faint accent I could not place, and expressed polite interest in our presence, without any indication of curiosity as to its purpose. Holmes said almost nothing during the introductions. He acknowledged each person with a brief nod, accepted a glass of sherry he did not drink, and positioned himself near one of the library windows in a manner that allowed him to observe the entire room without appearing to do so. I glanced at him once, and noticed that his grey eyes had become peculiarly still, the stillness not of disinterest but of a spring wound to its very limit. The remainder of the afternoon passed in desultory conversation. Holt dominated the discourse with anecdotes of his time at the bar. Reverend Drax contributed observations of a vaguely spiritual character, and Miss Eugenia attended to the practical arrangements of hospitality with the quiet competence that appeared to be her natural mode. Sass spoke little, and Holmes spoke less. I found myself filling conversational silences with remarks about the weather and the season, conscious all the while that Holmes was conducting some investigation of his own that had nothing to do with words. We were shown to our rooms as the autumn twilight gathered. The accommodations were comfortable, the servants attentive, and the house itself possessed of that profound quietness that belongs to old buildings far from the noise of cities. I unpacked my bag, washed, and was preparing to descend for dinner when Holmes appeared at my door. He entered without ceremony, closed the door behind him, and stood for a moment in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of intense concentration. "Well, Watson," he said at length, "what do you make of our company?" I confessed that I found them unremarkable, save perhaps for a certain studied quality in Holt's manner and a curious want of clerical warmth in Reverend Drax. Holmes nodded slowly. "Quite so," he said. "And did you observe the reaction when Sir Alister mentioned the year 1873? I admitted that I had been attending more closely to Sir Alister than to the others. "A pity," Holmes remarked, "for when that year was named, every person in the room save Mr. Sess displayed a reaction of immediate and involuntary recognition." Holt reached for his wine-glass, though it was empty. Miss Eugenia's posture contracted. Reverend Drax smoothed the tablecloth before him with a flattening, repetitive gesture. "They know what happened in 1873, Watson, and whatever it was, it is not a memory they welcome." He turned toward the door, paused, and looked back at me with an expression I could not immediately interpret. "If a man buries something deeply enough, Watson," he said quietly, "does he imagine that 22 years constitutes a permanent interment?" He did not wait for an answer, and I had none to give. He left the room as silently as he had entered, and I was left alone with the gathering darkness, and the sense that we had arrived at Ashgrove Grange not at the beginning of an inquiry, but somewhere very near its end. Chapter 2. Portraits, Peculiarities, and a Misplaced Year. The morning following our arrival dawned grey and still, the kind of October day when the mist clings to the meadows well past breakfast, and the sun, if it appears at all, does so with a wan reluctance. I rose early, as is my habit, and found Holmes already dressed and standing at the window of our shared sitting-room, gazing out across the grounds with an expression of such profound abstraction that I hesitated to disturb him. He acknowledged my entrance with the briefest of nods, and continued his observation of the garden below, where a solitary gardener was raking leaves with methodical precision. I poured coffee from the service that had been laid for us, and settled into a chair with the morning newspapers which had been sent up from London and arrived only slightly dampened by the journey. Holmes remained at the window for perhaps 10 minutes more, then turned abruptly and announced that he intended to spend the day in what he termed idle wandering. He would examine the library, he said, inspect the gardens, perhaps engage the other guests in conversation of no particular consequence. He advised me to occupy myself as I saw fit, and suggested that I might find the local countryside conducive to a morning walk, as the air would do me good, and my presence during his inquiries would serve no useful purpose. I confess I was somewhat nettled by this dismissal, but long experience has taught me that Holmes's methods, however peculiar, are not to be questioned in the early stages of an investigation. I took his advice and spent the better part of the morning walking the estate's perimeter, observing the orderly rows of the kitchen garden, the careful pollarding of the willows near the ornamental pond, and the general air of quiet prosperity that characterised the property. When I returned shortly before luncheon, I found Holmes exactly where I had left him, standing now before a portrait in the main hall, with his hands clasped behind his back, studying it with the intensity other men reserve for religious icons. The portrait depicted a younger Sir Alister, perhaps 40 years of age, in the robes and wig of his profession. The painting was competent but unremarkable, executed in the dark, varnished style popular some decades previous. I could discern nothing in it worthy of such prolonged attention, yet Holmes remained before it for several minutes after I joined him, his gaze moving from the painted face to the brass plaque beneath, which recorded the date of the sitting as 1872. Luncheon was served in the dining room, a formal affair despite the small company, and Sir Alister presided with the same careful courtesy he had shown the previous evening, though I noted that his hands trembled slightly as he carved the joint. The conversation was general and unremarkable until Holmes, with the air of a man making casual observation, remarked upon the age of a particular oak visible through the window. It was, he said, a fine specimen, 200 years old at the least, possibly older. Had it been planted when the house was built, or did it predate the structure? Sir Alister responded that the tree was indeed older than the house, which dated only to the middle of the previous century. The oak, he believed, had stood on the site since Elizabethan times, though he could not speak to the matter with certainty. Holmes nodded with apparent satisfaction, and allowed the subject to lapse. But I observed that Miss Eugenia, who had been attending to the service of vegetables, had paused in her movements for a fraction of a second, the serving spoon suspended above the dish. The meal progressed through its courses with the stately inevitability of such occasions. Holmes inquired of Reverend Drax about the history of the parish church, learned from Mr. Holt the details of a recent case argued at the Old Bailey, and drew from Mr. Sayes a learner's discourse on the challenges of cataloguing legal documents, according to both chronological and topical systems. Each subject was pursued with sufficient interest to seem genuine, yet each was abandoned after only a few exchanges, as though Holmes were sampling wines at a tasting rather than conducting a coherent conversation. It was only when we had progressed to the cheese and Sir Alister was describing the provenance of a set of Chancery record boxes stacked beneath the library stairs that I began to perceive a pattern in Holmes's seemingly aimless inquiries. The boxes, our host explained, contained papers from his time on the Exeter circuit, documents he had intended to donate to the county archives but had not yet found occasion to transport. They dated from his early years in practice, before his transfer to the London offices, and when, Holmes asked with studied casualness, had that transfer occurred? In 1874, Sir Alister replied. He had left Exeter in the spring of that year and taken up his position in London the following month. The year 1873, then, Holmes observed, had been your final full year on the Exeter circuit. Sir Alister confirmed that this was so. I watched the faces of the assembled company as this exchange unfolded. Mr. Holt reached for his wine-glass, though it was already empty, and turned it between his fingers with an abstracted air. Reverend Drax smoothed the tablecloth before him, with that same flattening, repetitive gesture I had observed the previous evening. Miss Eugenia's posture, ordinarily as erect as a governess's, contracted almost imperceptibly, her shoulders drawing inward by perhaps an inch. Only Mr. Sass appeared genuinely undisturbed, continuing to spread Stilton upon a biscuit, with the methodical attention of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere. Holmes allowed the subject to drop and turned the conversation to less fraught matters, but the damage, if I may use that term, had been done. The year 1873 hung over the remainder of the meal like smoke from a smouldering fire, invisible yet unmistakably present. The afternoon passed in much the same manner as the morning, with Holmes pursuing his policy of what I can only describe as strategic idleness. I accompanied him through the library, where he paused before certain volumes, examined the spines of others, and engaged Mr. Sass in a lengthy discussion of indexing methodologies that struck me as supremely tedious but which Holmes appeared to find fascinating. He inquired about the arrangement of the archive boxes, the system by which Sir Alister had preserved his papers, and the particular challenges posed by legal documents that bore multiple dates, the date of composition, the date of filing, and the date of the events they recorded. Mr. Sass, who warmed to his subject with the enthusiasm of a specialist given rare opportunity to expound, explained that such documents required what he termed triangulated dating, a system whereby each date was recorded and cross-referenced to allow retrieval by any of the three temporal markers. Sir Alister, he added with evident approval, had been remarkably systematic in his record-keeping, though there were occasional anomalies, gaps in sequence numbers, files that appeared to have been removed and never replaced. Holmes expressed interest in these anomalies and asked whether Mr. Sass had catalogued them. The archivist confirmed that he had, noting each gap with a standard notation indicating missing material. It was not uncommon, he said, in collections of this age. Papers were borrowed, misfiled, occasionally lost entirely. The gaps told their own story, though rarely one of any particular interest. Holmes thanked him for the explanation, and moved on to examine a glass cabinet containing what appeared to be a collection of legal seals and stamps. I followed, increasingly mystified by the apparent aimlessness of his method, yet increasingly certain that there was nothing aimless about it whatsoever. We took tea in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock. The company assembled with the punctuality of those accustomed to keeping regular hours, and the conversation turned to topics of no consequence: the weather, the state of the autumn shooting, the upcoming county assizes. Holmes contributed little, seeming content to observe and listen. But I noted that whenever the year 1873 approached, even tangentially, the conversation veered away as though by mutual, unspoken agreement. It was only later, after we had retired to our rooms to dress for dinner, that Holmes spoke to me with any directness. I had knocked upon his door to borrow a collar stud, and found him seated at the writing desk, staring at a sheet of paper upon which he had written nothing whatsoever. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment I saw in his face an expression of such intense concentration that I nearly withdrew without speaking. "Watson," he said quietly, "if a secret is buried deeply enough, does the fact of its burial itself become a kind of record?" I confess that I did not follow his meaning. He rose and moved to the window, looking out across the darkening grounds. "Consider a document," he said, "that has been deliberately removed from a sequence. The document itself may be lost or destroyed, but the gap it leaves behind is as much a fact as the document would have been. It is a negative space, Watson, but negative space has shape. It can be measured, and if one knows where to look, it can sometimes be reconstructed with nearly the precision of the original." I asked him whether he had found such a gap. He did not answer directly. Instead, he turned from the window and regarded me with an expression I had seen before, the look of a man who has glimpsed the outline of something large and dark moving beneath still water. "I have found," he said slowly, "that every person in this house save Mr. Sass knows something. They are not saying about the year 1873. I have found that Sir Alister left Exeter rather abruptly that spring, under circumstances he declines to specify. I have found that there are gaps in his archive corresponding precisely to cases heard on the Exeter circuit in the 6 months preceding his departure, and I have found that when that year is mentioned, even in passing, the reactions are not those of persons recalling ordinary professional matters." He paused, as though weighing whether to continue. "I have found, Watson, all the evidence of a secret. What I have not yet found is the secret itself." I asked him what he proposed to do. He smiled faintly, a smile of neither warmth nor humour. "I propose," he said, "to continue wandering idly. Secrets, Watson, are like wild creatures. They cannot be hunted directly. One must wait for them to show themselves. With that enigmatic pronouncement, he ushered me from the room and we descended to dinner. The meal was a repetition of luncheon in its essential character. Formal, correct, and marked by the same careful avoidance of certain subjects that I had observed earlier. Holmes ate sparingly and spoke less, but his eyes, I noticed, never ceased their movement, cataloguing, recording, assembling some picture I could not yet perceive. It was only much later, after the company had dispersed and the house had settled into silence, that I witnessed the scene I was not meant to see. Unable to sleep, I had risen and walked to the window of my chamber, intending merely to observe the night. The hour was past midnight, and the house lay in darkness save for a single window on the ground floor, the window of Sir Alister's study, where a faint light burned. As I watched, the light moved, and I saw through the gap in the curtains the figure of our host, standing at his desk with a candle in one hand and in the other a slim folder of papers. He appeared to be reading, or perhaps merely looking at them, for he did not turn the pages. He stood thus for several minutes, motionless, the candlelight casting his shadow long and wavering against the wall behind him. Then, with a movement of such finality that I felt it across the distance that separated us, he closed the folder, replaced it in a drawer which he locked, and extinguished the candle. The darkness returned, complete and absolute. I stood at the window for some time afterward, but the light did not reappear. When at last I returned to my bed, I carried with me the image of Sir Alister's face in that moment before the darkness claimed it, the expression of a man reviewing the terms of a debt that has come, at last, due. Chapter 3. The Crime of the Early Morning. I was awakened at 7:30 by a sound I had not heard since my days in Afghanistan. A woman's scream, sharp and terrible, cut off almost as soon as it began. I was out of bed and into my trousers before full consciousness returned, moving with that instinctive rapidity which old campaigners never entirely lose. Holmes emerged from his chamber at the same moment, already dressed, as though he had been awake and waiting for precisely this summons. We reached the ground floor to find the household in a state of subdued chaos. Miss Eugenia stood at the door of her uncle's study, one hand pressed to her mouth, her face drained of all colour. The manservant who had received us 2 days previous hovered uncertainly in the hall, and from the direction of the kitchen came the sound of the housekeeper's voice raised in agitation. Holmes moved past Miss Eugenia without ceremony and entered the study. I followed, though some instinct made me pause at the threshold to attend first to the young woman, who appeared on the verge of collapse. She waved away my concern with a gesture that was at once imperious and defeated, and gestured toward the interior of the room. "Go," she said. "There is nothing to be done for him now." The study was a gentleman's retreat, lined with books and furnished in that style of comfortable austerity favoured by men whose work is their lives. Sir Alister Pemberton Vane sat at his writing desk in apparent composure, as though he had simply fallen asleep over his papers. His head was inclined slightly forward, his hands resting upon the blotter, his expression one of perfect tranquillity. Only the unnatural stillness of his chest, the waxen quality of his skin, and a faint discoloration about the lips betrayed the fact that he had been dead for some hours. Holmes approached the body with that particular economy of motion I had observed in him countless times before, moving with a precision that suggested each step had been calculated to disturb as little as possible. He did not touch Sir Alister immediately, but stood instead surveying the scene entire, his gaze moving methodically from the window to the door, from the hearth to the desk, cataloguing details I could not yet perceive. The local physician arrived within 20 minutes, unsummoned by the manservant before we had descended. He was a stout, capable man of middle years named Hargreaves, who examined the body with professional efficiency and pronounced what Holmes and I had already surmised. Sir Alister had been poisoned, almost certainly by prussic acid, administered some hours previous. The symptoms were unmistakable, the faint scent of bitter almonds still detectable, though fading, the characteristic discoloration, the rapidity with which death must have supervened. Dr. Hargreaves indicated the brandy glass standing on a small table beside the desk, still containing perhaps an ounce of liquid. Sir Alister, he said, was known to take a glass of warm brandy each evening before retiring. It was his invariable habit, observed with the regularity of a man whose life had been governed by routine. The poison, Hargreaves concluded, had almost certainly been introduced into that nightly draught. Holmes listened to this explanation with an attention that appeared cursory, but which I knew to be absolute. When the physician had concluded, Holmes requested and received permission to examine the room undisturbed for a period of 7 minutes. Hargreaves, to his credit, recognised that he was in the presence of a superior intelligence, and withdrew without protest. I remained at the threshold, as was my custom, observing without interfering. What followed was a demonstration of method I had witnessed before, but which never ceased to command my admiration. Holmes moved about the chamber with the focused intensity of a bloodhound upon a scent, crouching to examine the carpet beneath the desk, straightening to hold the brandy glass to the grey morning light, lifting the edge of the blotter with a single extended finger to observe what lay beneath. He made no notes, offered no commentary, but I could see the gathering of data proceeding behind his eyes with mechanical efficiency. After perhaps 5 minutes, he turned his attention to the papers upon the desk, and here his movements became, if possible, even more deliberate. He did not touch them directly, but leaned close, examining them from various angles, noting their arrangement with the care a cartographer might employ in mapping uncharted territory. At length he straightened and called me to his side. I approached and looked where he indicated. The desk was covered with the usual impedimenta of correspondence, ledgers, a standish, a small stack of recent newspapers, but dominating the surface was a slim folder of dark leather, lying open, its contents partially visible. I recognised it immediately as the folder I had seen Sir Alister examining by candlelight the previous night. Holmes directed my attention to 3 particulars. First, the folder itself. Its contents, he noted, had been disturbed since Sir Alister last handled them. The papers were not precisely disordered, but they had been leafed through, examined, and returned to a sequence that was almost but not quite their original arrangement. The disturbance was subtle, visible only to one who understood how documents settle when left undisturbed versus how they lie when recently handled. Second, the ink blotter. Holmes indicated faint impressions upon its surface, the mirror image traces of recent writing. The impressions were fragmentary and difficult to decipher, but they suggested not the casual blotting of correspondence, but the deliberate flattening of something specific, perhaps a single sheet pressed firmly to absorb excess ink. Third, and most arresting, the innermost sleeve of the folder. Holmes drew my attention to a faint rectangular shadow visible against the darker leather, a space where a document had once rested, and where none now lay. The shadow was precise in its dimensions, perhaps 8 inches by 10, the size of a standard legal document. Whatever had occupied that space was gone. I asked Holmes what he made of these observations. He did not answer immediately, but remained bent over the desk, his eyes moving across the surface with undiminished intensity. When he finally spoke, it was not to me, but to himself, in that half-audible murmur he employed when reasoning aloud. The folder was examined after death, he said. The papers were searched, but not by the victim. Something specific was sought, and possibly found. The missing document may be the object of that search, or it may have been removed by Sir Alister himself before his death. The blotter suggests he was writing, or perhaps copying, shortly before he took his fatal draught. He straightened and turned to survey the room once more. The door shows no signs of forced entry. The window is secured from within. Whoever introduced the poison into that brandy glass either had access to this room during the hours when Sir Alister was absent, or was sufficiently familiar with the household routine to know when and where the glass would be prepared. The poison itself suggests premeditation of considerable duration. Prussic acid is not a substance one acquires casually or employs upon impulse. I ventured that the murderer must be someone within the house. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, but offered no further comment. His 7 minutes had elapsed, and already I could hear voices in the hall, the machinery of official inquiry beginning its ponderous engagement. Holmes withdrew from the study and requested that the room be locked and left undisturbed pending the arrival of the police from London. The remainder of the morning passed in that peculiar suspension of normal activity that follows sudden death. The household moved through its routines with mechanical precision, as though preserving the forms of ordinary life might somehow restore its substance. Breakfast was laid, but largely uneaten. The servants went about their duties in whispers. Miss Eugenia retreated to her rooms and did not reappear. Holmes conducted a series of brief interviews with each member of the household, ostensibly to establish the sequence of events leading to the discovery of the body. I attended these conversations and recorded, as was my practice, the substance of each exchange, though at the time I could discern little of significance in what was said. Mr. Holt wept openly and at length, a display of grief that struck me as entirely genuine in its substance, yet somehow excessive in its expression. His eyes, I noted with some discomfort, were entirely dry, even as he pressed a handkerchief to them repeatedly, and spoke in broken phrases of his long friendship with the deceased. Reverend Drax received the news with a composure that seemed almost rehearsed, immediately offering prayers for the dead man's soul, and expressing his readiness to assist in whatever capacity the church might serve. There was something in his manner that put me in mind of an actor who is prepared thoroughly for a role and is determined to perform it correctly. Miss Eugenia, when she finally descended, was pale but composed. Her self-possession returned, though the cost of maintaining it was visible in the tension of her jaw and the careful deliberation of her movements. She answered Holmes's questions with precision, confirmed that she had discovered her uncle at the usual hour when she brought his morning correspondence, and acknowledged that she had screamed before understanding fully what she had found. Mr. Sass expressed a formal condolence in the manner of one whose connection to the deceased was professional rather than personal. He inquired, with a diffidence that did not entirely conceal his concern, whether his cataloguing commission would be honoured by the estate, as he had travelled some distance to undertake the work and had incurred expenses in anticipation of its completion. Holmes registered this question with a faint elevation of one eyebrow, but offered no comment beyond the observation that such matters would be determined in due course. It was only later, when we had retired briefly to our rooms before the arrival of the official police, that Holmes spoke to me with any directness regarding his conclusions. I found him standing at the window, as had become his habit, or was staring out across the grounds with an expression of profound concentration. I asked him what he had learned from the morning's interviews. He turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes that peculiar light I had come to recognise as the precursor to revelation. I have learned, Watson, that every person in this house had reason to fear what Sir Alister might reveal, and that at least one of them had reason sufficient to prevent that revelation permanently. I have learned that the crime before us is not a crime of impulse but of calculation, executed with a precision that suggests either professional knowledge or careful study, and I have learned, most significantly, that the document missing from that folder may be the only record of whatever secret drove one among this company to murder. He paused, his gaze returning to the window. What I have not yet learned, he continued quietly, is which among them possessed both the knowledge to acquire prussic acid and the opportunity to introduce it into that brandy glass. But I shall learn it, Watson. Of that you may be certain. The sound of wheels upon gravel announced the arrival of the police. Holmes straightened his cuffs, assumed that expression of polite attention he reserved for official inquiries, and descended to meet them. I followed, carrying with me the image of Sir Alister as I had last seen him, seated in death at his desk, his secrets scattered before him, one secret removed entirely, and somewhere in this house of careful silences, a murderer waiting to learn whether those secrets would die with him or live to speak his name. Chapter 4. Red Herrings in 3 Varieties. Inspector Lestrade arrived from London shortly before noon, accompanied by a sergeant and that air of confident energy which characterised his approach to criminal investigation. I had worked with Lestrade on sufficient occasions to recognise both his genuine competence and his limitations, and I observed with some amusement that Holmes greeted him with the particular species of courtesy one reserves for valued colleagues whose methods one does not entirely respect. The inspector took possession of the study with professional efficiency, examined the body with appropriate gravity, and listened to Dr. Hargreaves's conclusions regarding the poison with several vigorous nods of agreement. He then requested that Holmes provide him with a summary of the household arrangements and any observations that might bear upon the case. Holmes complied with admirable brevity, describing the composition of the company, the nature of Sir Alister's concerns prior to his death, and the 3 particulars he had noted during his examination of the desk. Lestrade listened with the focused attention of a man taking mental notes, and when Holmes had concluded, the inspector straightened his shoulders with visible satisfaction. "I believe, Mr. Holmes, that we have here a case of considerable clarity once one strips away the incidental complications. Sir Alister's estate, I am informed, is worth in excess of £20,000. Miss Eugenia Pemberton Vane is the principal heir. We have motive established. We require only opportunity and means." Holmes inclined his head in a gesture that might have signified agreement or merely acknowledgment. I recognised it as the expression he assumed when preparing to allow another to proceed along a path he had already determined to be incorrect. Lestrade continued with gathering momentum. "The opportunity presents no difficulty. Miss Eugenia manages the household. She would have ready access to her uncle's study, to his habits, to the preparation of his nightly brandy. The servants are under her direction. She might easily have introduced the poison at any time during the evening hours. And the means," I ventured. Lestrade produced from his coat pocket a folded paper, which he smoothed upon the desk with evident pride. A receipt, he announced, from a chemist's establishment in Holborn, dated 6 weeks previous. The receipt recorded the purchase of prussic acid in solution, ostensibly for photographic purposes, yet under a name which Lestrade acknowledged to be false, but which bore, he argued, certain orthographic similarities to Miss Eugenia's handwriting, as evidenced by the household accounts he had examined that morning. He laid beside the receipt several pages from the account ledger, and I confess that even to my untrained eye there were superficial resemblances in the formation of certain letters, a particular loop in the capital E, a distinctive cross upon the letter T. Holmes examined both documents with care, holding them to the light, comparing them at length. When he finally spoke, his tone was one of polite interest rather than conviction. "The similarities are suggestive, Inspector. Have you confronted Miss Eugenia with this evidence?" "Not yet," Lestrade replied. "I wished first to establish the complete chain of circumstance. But I believe we have sufficient grounds to pursue this line of inquiry with vigour." Holmes returned the papers with a slight bow. "I have no doubt, Inspector, that you will pursue all lines of inquiry with your characteristic thoroughness. For my own part, I should like to continue my examination of Sir Alister's papers, if the official investigation has no objection." Lestrade, gratified by what he took to be Holmes's deference to his authority, granted permission readily. Holmes withdrew, and I followed, leaving the inspector to his methodical cataloguing of the scene. We did not, however, proceed to any further examination of Sir Alister's correspondence. Instead, Holmes led me directly to the library and to the stack of Chancery record boxes he had remarked upon during our first day at the Grange. He knelt beside them with the air of a man who has at last arrived at his true destination, and began to remove the boxes one by one, examining the labels affixed to each. The boxes were arranged chronologically, each bearing a notation indicating the year and circuit to which its contents pertained. Holmes worked through them systematically, occasionally removing a box entirely to examine its contents. more often simply noting the label and returning it to its position. I stood by, increasingly mystified, as the afternoon wore on and Holmes's attention remained fixed upon these dusty repositories of long-concluded legal matters. It was perhaps 3 o'clock when the housekeeper appeared with intelligence that would materially alter Lestrade's theory, though not in the manner the inspector anticipated. She had come, she said, to inform the authorities of a matter that had been troubling her conscience since the discovery of Sir Alister's body. She had hesitated to speak earlier, not wishing to cast aspersions upon any member of the household, but she felt it her duty to report what she knew. Holmes rose from his examination of the boxes and gave her his complete attention. The housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50, with the forthright manner of one accustomed to managing difficult situations, explained that Sir Alister and Mr. Holt had quarrelled bitterly the previous spring. The matter concerned a failed investment venture into which Sir Alister had drawn several friends, including Mr. Holt, and which had resulted in considerable financial loss. Mr. Holt had accused Sir Alister of negligence in the management of the investment and had departed Ashgrove in anger, vowing never to return. Yet he had returned, Holmes observed quietly. The housekeeper confirmed this. Mr. Holt had written to Sir Alister in early September, requesting the invitation which had brought him to the Grange for this autumnal visit. The reconciliation, if such it could be called, had been effected by correspondence, and the housekeeper had understood from remarks made by Sir Alister that Mr. Holt was in considerably diminished circumstances and required assistance which Sir Alister, with his characteristic generosity, was prepared to provide. Holmes thanked her for this information, and requested that she inform Inspector Lestrade of what she had told us. She departed, and I heard her footsteps receding toward the study where Lestrade continued his investigations. I remarked to Holmes that this intelligence would surely redirect the inspector's suspicions toward Holt. Holmes returned to his examination of the boxes without comment. I observed that he had now reached those dating from 1873, and was removing them entirely from the stack, carrying them to a nearby table where better light was available. He worked in silence for perhaps 20 minutes, leafing through documents with practised efficiency, occasionally pausing to read a passage more closely, or to compare two separate papers. At length I could contain my curiosity no longer, and asked him directly what he sought. He looked up from a bundle of case files tied with faded ribbon. "I seek, Watson, the shape of an absence. I seek the record of something that should be here but is not. I seek evidence of a crime committed not last night but 22 years ago, a crime which has waited patiently for its consequences to mature." He returned to his examination, and I knew better than to interrupt further. Lestrade found us there an hour later, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished but his determination unimpaired. He had interviewed the housekeeper and had subsequently questioned Mr. Holt regarding the investment quarrel. Holt had not denied the facts, but had insisted that the reconciliation was genuine, that he bore Sir Alister no ill will, and that he had been in his chamber at the time the poison must have been administered. The inspector had also conducted a search of Mr. Holt's belongings, and had discovered letters from creditors, and notices of debts, and evidence of financial distress sufficient to establish motive beyond question. Jealousy, humiliation, financial ruin. Lestrade enumerated these with grim satisfaction, and I confess that even I began to see in Holt a plausible suspect. Yet Holmes appeared unmoved by these revelations. He listened with that same polite attention he had shown earlier, offered no opinion for or against the theory, and returned Lestrade's questions with answers that were perfectly accurate yet somehow evasive in their ultimate significance. When the inspector had departed to pursue further inquiries, I asked Holmes directly what he made of Lestrade's case against Holt. He set aside the document he had been examining and regarded me with an expression of mild exasperation. "Lestrade has assembled a collection of facts, Watson, each one genuine, each one damaging, and each one entirely beside the point. Miss Eugenia had motive and opportunity. Mr. Holt had motive and opportunity. No doubt if we inquired further, we should discover that Reverend Drax had some grievance, real or imagined, and that he too possessed motive and opportunity. Then you believe all three theories are false? I believe, Holmes said with some asperity, that Lestrade is pursuing the case he can see, rather than the case that exists. He is hunting in the present for a crime whose roots lie in the past. He's examining motives that arose last spring or last month, when he should be examining a motive that arose in 1873. He rose and moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. The afternoon light was failing, and the library had taken on that quality of premature twilight peculiar to book-lined rooms in autumn. I have spent the afternoon, Watson, in the company of ghosts. I have examined cases tried on the Exeter circuit between January and June of 1873. I have noted the sequence numbers, the filing dates, the case types, and I have discovered precisely what I expected to discover: a gap in the sequence, a case that should be present but is not, a record that has been removed and never replaced. I asked him what case it was. He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. I do not yet know, Watson. The record itself is gone, but I know its approximate date. I know the court in which it was heard, and I know that it involved three men, Sir Alistair Pemberton Vane, Mr. Crispin Holt, and one other whose identity I have not yet established, but whom I believe to be connected to someone presently in this house. He turned from the window. I've dispatched 3 telegrams to the Exeter County Records Office, to the Clerk of the Crown in London, and to a contact of mine who specialises in the reconstruction of lost documents. I've requested information regarding any case heard on the Exeter circuit in early 1873 that involved accusations of fraud or embezzlement, and that was resolved in an irregular manner, and when you receive replies. Then, Watson, I shall know the nature of the secret that has waited 22 years to claim its price. He moved toward the door, paused, and looked back at the scattered boxes and files that represented his afternoon's labour. The crime you see before you, he said quietly, is merely the last chapter of a story begun long before any of us were present for it. Lestrade is investigating a murder. I am investigating the reason that murder became necessary. We ascended to dress for dinner, leaving the library in its gathering darkness, the archive boxes standing open like tombs whose contents had been too long undisturbed. Chapter 5. The Exeter Affair of 1873. The telegrams arrived the following morning in a sequence that suggested Holmes's correspondence had accorded his inquiries the priority he had requested. I was at breakfast when the first messenger appeared, a boy from the village post office who presented an envelope marked with the seal of the Exeter County Records Office. Holmes received it without visible reaction, slit the envelope with a butter knife, and read the contents in silence while his coffee grew cold beside him. The second telegram followed within the quarter hour, this one from the Clerk of the Crown in London. Holmes read it with the same impassive attention he had given the first, folded both messages together, and placed them in his waistcoat pocket. He then resumed his breakfast as though nothing of consequence had occurred, a performance I found maddening but knew better than to interrupt. It was only when we had retired to the small sitting room that had been placed at our disposal that Holmes withdrew the telegrams and spread them upon the table before us. He did not invite me to read them, but instead summarised their contents in that clipped, precise manner he employed when reconstructing events from fragmentary evidence. The Exeter County Records Office, he began, confirms that there is indeed a gap in the case sequence for the spring assizes of 1873. The missing case bore the number E-73-247 and was listed in the preliminary docket as Regina versus Thomas Edward Crail, the charge being fraudulent conversion of trust funds. The case was scheduled for hearing on the 14th of April, 1873. He paused, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm upon the table's edge. The Clerk of the Crown's office has no record of the case proceeding to trial. There is no verdict recorded, no sentence imposed, no notation of dismissal or withdrawal. The case simply vanishes from the official record after its initial docket entry. It is as though Thomas Edward Crail appeared before the assizes and then, quite literally, disappeared from the annals of English jurisprudence. I ventured that such oversights, while regrettable, were perhaps not uncommon in the management of county records. Holmes fixed me with a look of patient forbearance. "My dear Watson, cases do not vanish by oversight. They are withdrawn, they are dismissed, they proceed to verdict, or they are continued to a subsequent session. In each instance, the disposition is recorded. A case that leaves no trace of its resolution is not an oversight. It is an impossibility, unless someone has deliberately ensured that impossibility." He rose and moved to the window, that habitual station from which he conducted his most serious reasoning. "The third telegram," he continued, "has not yet arrived, but I do not require it to reconstruct the essential features of what occurred. Thomas Crail was accused of fraudulent conversion. The case was prepared for trial, and then, and through the intervention of persons with access to the court records, the indictment was misfiled in such a manner that it could not be located when the case was called. But surely, I protested, the prosecution would have noticed the absence of the indictment. The case would have been continued until the document could be found." Holmes turned from the window with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Precisely, Watson. The case would have been continued, and continued again, until eventually it would have been dismissed for want of prosecution. But that process takes time, months at minimum. And during those months, Thomas Crail would have remained at liberty, free to remove himself beyond the reach of English law." He returned to the table and extracted from his pocket a small notebook in which he had been making entries throughout our stay at Ashgrove. He consulted it briefly before continuing. "I have established through conversation with Mr. Sayers that the archival cataloguing system employed by Sir Alister was unusual in its precision. Each document was assigned not only a chronological position, but also a categorical designation and a unique identifying number derived from the court's own filing system. A missing document of the type we are discussing would not simply be lost. Its absence would leave a gap as visible as a missing tooth. And you believe Sir Alister created that gap deliberately?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that Sir Alister, acting in concert with at least one other person, would remove the indictment against Thomas Crail from the sequence in which it should have been filed, and placed it in a position where it would not be found during the normal course of legal proceedings. The misfiling was not accidental. It was calculated to produce precisely the result it achieved, the effective dismissal of a criminal prosecution. I asked him who he believed to be Sir Alister's accomplice in this scheme." Holmes consulted his notebook once more. Mr. Crispin Holt was practising on the Exeter circuit in 1873. His name appears in the records of several cases heard during that same session of the assizes. He would have had access to the court offices. He would have understood the filing system. And he would have possessed the technical knowledge necessary to misfile a document in a manner that would not immediately arouse suspicion. The implications of this reconstruction were profound, and I confess I required a moment to absorb them fully. If Holmes was correct, Sir Alister and Holt had conspired to obstruct justice in a criminal matter, had enabled a man accused of fraud to escape prosecution, and had maintained that secret for more than 2 decades. But why? I asked. Would men of such professional standing risk their reputations and their liberty to assist a common swindler? Holmes was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "That, Watson, is the question upon which the entire matter turns. What was the relationship between Sir Alister Pemberton Vane, Crispin Holt, and Thomas Edward Crail? What consideration moved them to such extraordinary measures, and most significantly, what became of Crail after he slipped the noose they had loosened for him?" The third telegram arrived shortly before luncheon, delivered by special messenger from London. Holmes read it with an attention that bordered on intensity, then passed it to me without comment. The message was from Holmes's contact, the individual he had referred to only as Brother Montague, and it contained information of a character both specific and devastating. Thomas Edward Crail had indeed escaped prosecution in 1873. He He had left England within weeks of the scheduled trial date and had taken up residence in Madeira, where he had lived for approximately 18 years under his own name, apparently undisturbed by any fear of extradition. He had died there in 1891, of causes the telegram did not specify, leaving behind debts and a modest estate that had been insufficient to satisfy his creditors. The telegram concluded with a detail that Holmes had anticipated, but which nonetheless carried considerable weight. Thomas Edward Crail had a younger brother, one Octavius Crail, who had entered the church and had taken a living in the west of England in 1875. Octavius, I said, Reverend Octavius Drax. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment. Drax is not an uncommon name, and I suspect our reverend friend adopted it upon taking orders, perhaps to distance himself from his brother's disgrace. But the Christian name is less common, and the timing is suggestive. A man entering the church in 1875, 2 years after his brother fled England to avoid prosecution, might well choose to obscure the family connection. I struggled to assemble these pieces into a coherent picture. You're suggesting that Reverend Drax killed Sir Alistair to prevent the exposure of the misfiling that had allowed his brother to escape justice. Holmes settled into a chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture I recognised as indicating deep consideration. I am suggesting, Watson, that we must understand what the misfiling actually accomplished. It did not save Thomas Crail. He fled England, lived in diminished circumstances in Madeira, and died there unremarkable and unmourned. The misfiling merely postponed his reckoning. It did not prevent it. Then what was its purpose? Holmes was silent for a time, and when he spoke his voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. That, Watson, is what I do not yet fully comprehend. The misfiling required considerable risk and effort. It was executed with precision by men who had much to lose. Yet it benefited Thomas Crail only temporarily and incompletely. There is a piece of this puzzle I have not yet identified, a consideration that made the risk worthwhile despite the inadequacy of the result. He rose and moved once more to the window, his habitual refuge during moments of incomplete understanding. What we know is this. In 1873, 3 men conspired to obstruct justice. One of those men, Thomas Crail, is dead. The second, Sir Alistair Pemberton Vane, has been murdered. The third, Crispin Holt, remains alive and present in this house, and Reverend Drax is the brother of the man they attempted to save. Holmes nodded slowly. And Reverend Drax is the brother of the man they failed to save. That distinction, Watson, may prove to be everything. We descended to luncheon in a state of abstraction that must have been evident to the company, though none remarked upon it. The meal proceeded with the same careful formality that had characterised all gatherings since Sir Alistair's death, each person maintaining the proprieties even as suspicion hung over the table like smoke. I observed the faces of those assembled with new understanding. Holt, whose bonhomie now appeared not merely studied but desperate, a man attempting to maintain a performance even as the stage collapsed beneath him. Reverend Drax, whose piety seemed less a conviction than a costume, assumed to cover something darker, Miss Eugenia, whose composure suggested not innocence but rather the determination of one who has learned that survival requires the suppression of all visible emotion. Only Mr. Sass appeared unchanged, continuing his methodical consumption of food and his occasional contributions to the conversation with the detachment of one whose interests lay entirely outside the human drama unfolding around him. Holmes ate sparingly and spoke less, but I could see the machinery of his mind operating with undiminished intensity. He was assembling pieces, testing connections, discarding hypotheses that failed to accommodate all the available facts. It was only as we rose from the table that he spoke to me in an undertone that carried an unusual urgency. "Watson, I require your assistance this afternoon. I must interview each member of this household separately and in confidence. I need you to observe not what they say, but how they say it. Note every hesitation, every deflection, every moment when their words and their expressions fail to correspond. I assured him of my cooperation. He gripped my arm briefly, a gesture of reliance he rarely permitted himself. "We are close, Watson. The shape of the thing is becoming visible. But there is still a question I cannot answer, and until I answer it, I cannot be certain which among this company transformed a 22-year-old conspiracy into a present murder." He released my arm and moved toward the library, where Lestrade was conducting his own parallel investigation with an enthusiasm undiminished by the complexity of the evidence. I followed, yet I was conscious that we were approaching some crisis, though I could not yet perceive its precise nature or timing. The afternoon stretched before us, full of questions whose answers Holmes pursued with the relentless patience of a man who knows that truth, however deeply buried, will eventually yield a sufficiently determined excavation. Chapter 6. The Afternoon of Careful Questions. Holmes conducted his interviews in the small study adjacent to the library, a modest chamber Sir Alistair had apparently used for correspondence of a less formal character than that which occupied his main desk. It was furnished with a single writing table, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the kitchen garden, offering a prospect of sufficient tranquillity to put even a nervous subject at ease. I positioned myself in a Windsor chair near the hearth, a notebook upon my knee, affecting the posture of a medical man recording case notes, rather than that of an investigator cataloguing evidence. Holmes had requested that I observe without apparent observation, and I did my best to fulfil that peculiar commission. Miss Eugenia was the first to be interviewed, arriving with the punctuality I had come to expect from her. She settled into the chair Holmes indicated with a composure that struck me as remarkable given the circumstances. Her black dress was severe, her hair drawn back with uncompromising neatness, and her hands, folded in her lap, remained perfectly still throughout the interview. Holmes began with questions of a purely factual character. Had she observed anything unusual in her uncle's behaviour during the days preceding his death? Had he mentioned receiving correspondence of a disturbing nature? Had any member of the household requested access to his study during hours when he was absent? Miss Eugenia answered each question with precision. Her uncle had been distressed, yes, but he had not confided the cause of that distress. He had received letters, but she had not seen them nor asked their contents. As to access to the study, she could not speak with certainty, as her duties took her throughout the house, and she could not monitor every movement of every person. Holmes then shifted to what appeared to be matters of no consequence. Had her uncle ever spoken of his time on the Exeter circuit? Did she recall him mentioning any particular cases from that period? Had he maintained friendships with colleagues from those years? Here, for the first time, I observed a hesitation. Miss Eugenia's gaze moved briefly to the window before returning to Holmes. Her uncle had spoken rarely of Exeter, she said. It had not been a happy time for him, though he had never explained why. As to friendships, Mr. Holt was the only one she knew of who dated from that period, and their relationship had been strained of late. Holmes asked whether she knew the cause of that strain. The investment matter, she replied, with a faint contraction of her lips that suggested distaste. Uncle Alistair had persuaded Mr. Holt and several others to invest in a mining venture that had failed utterly. Mr. Holt had lost a considerable sum and had been understandably bitter about it. Had her uncle expressed remorse for the failed venture? Miss Eugenia's answer came after a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. A pause I noted in my journal with particular care. He had expressed regret, she said finally, but not remorse. He had said that sometimes one must pay for old debts in unexpected currency, and that the mining investment was perhaps such a payment. Holmes leaned forward with an intensity that transformed his entire aspect. Those were his precise words. Old debts in unexpected currency. Yes, Miss Eugenia replied, though I confess I did not understand his meaning at the time, nor do I understand it now. Holmes thanked her and requested that she send Mr. Holt to him. She departed with the same self-possession she had maintained throughout, and I noted that her step upon the threshold did not falter, nor her posture alter as she passed from view. I observed to Holmes that her composure was either remarkable or rehearsed. Or both, Watson, he replied. The two are not mutually exclusive. Mr. Holt arrived some minutes later, his florid face bearing traces of the tears I had witnessed at breakfast. He settled into the chair with visible discomfort, and addressed Holmes with a deference that struck me as excessive. The interview followed much the same pattern as the first, though Holt's answers were longer and more elaborately phrased. Yes, Sir Alister had been troubled. Yes, there had been anonymous letters, though Holt had not seen them. Yes, the household had been uneasy, though he could not specify the cause of that uneasiness beyond the general atmosphere of distress. When Holmes turned to the Exeter years, however, Holt's manner underwent a subtle but unmistakable transformation. His hands, which had been gesticulating freely during his earlier responses, became still. His gaze, which had met Holmes's directly, began to drift toward the window with increasing frequency. Holmes asked about specific cases from the spring of 1873, inventing names and circumstances with such casual authority that even I, who knew them to be fabrications, found them plausible. Holt disclaimed knowledge of most, acknowledged vague recollection of others, and repeatedly insisted that his memory of cases more than 20 years old was imperfect at best. Then Holmes asked about Thomas Crail. The effect was immediate and devastating. Holt's face, already flushed, became a deeper crimson. His breathing, previously regular, became audible. He raised one hand to his collar as though it had suddenly grown too tight, and when he spoke his voice had lost all its earlier fluency. I knew of the case, he said. It was a matter of fraudulent conversion, as I recall. The accused fled the country before trial. The matter was resolved by his absence. Resolved, Holmes repeated with a peculiar emphasis. An interesting choice of word, Mr. Holt. Not dismissed, not abandoned, but resolved. Holt recovered himself with visible effort. I misspoke. The case was left unresolved. Crail's flight prevented any adjudication of the charges. Holmes allowed a silence to develop, a silence that extended until it became oppressive. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. Mr. Holt, I must ask you directly, did you assist in any manner in the misfiling of the indictment against Thomas Crail? Holt rose from his chair with an abruptness that nearly overturned it. I will not be subjected to such accusations, he declared, his voice rising. I came here at Sir Alister's invitation. I have answered your questions with patience and honesty. I will not remain to be insulted. He departed before Holmes could respond, his footsteps heavy upon the stairs as he ascended to his chamber. I observed that we had struck a nerve. Holmes remained seated, his expression thoughtful. We have struck the nerve, Watson. But whether it is the nerve of guilt or merely of complicity in an old indiscretion, I cannot yet determine. Reverend Drax arrived for his interview with an air of pastoral resignation, as though he were attending a deathbed rather than answering questions. He seated himself with deliberate care and folded his hands in an attitude of prayer. Holmes conducted this interview with particular delicacy. He inquired about Drax's acquaintance with Sir Alister, learned that it dated from approximately 5 years previous through family connections he did not specify. He asked about Drax's ministry, about his theological training, about his path to ordination. Drax answered each question with measured piety, his responses peppered with scriptural allusions and moral observations that struck me as rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He had known Sir Alister to be a man of conscience troubled by unnamed burdens. He had offered what spiritual counsel he could, though Sir Alister had not been forthcoming about the specific nature of his distress. When Holmes inquired about Drax's family, the Reverend's composure wavered for the first time. He had a brother, he admitted, now deceased. The brother had lived abroad for many years, and they had been estranged. The subject was painful, and he preferred not to discuss it further. Holmes did not press the matter, but instead asked a question that appeared to have no connection to what had preceded it. Had Drax known, prior to arriving at Ashgrove, that Mr. Sayers had been engaged to catalogue Sir Alister's papers? Drax's hesitation was brief but unmistakable. I had heard mention of it, he said. I believe my brother's solicitor had some connection to the firm that arranged the commission, though I cannot recall the details with certainty. Holmes thanked him and dismissed him with a courtesy that bordered on warmth. Drax departed with visible relief, and I heard him descending to the drawing-room where tea was being laid. I remarked to Holmes that Drax's mention of knowing about the cataloguing project in advance was significant. Holmes rose and moved to the window, staring out at the kitchen garden where the afternoon light was beginning to fail. It is significant, Watson, because it establishes that Drax knew, months before any of the others, that Sir Alister's archive would be subjected to systematic examination. He knew that the misfiled indictment, which had lain dormant for 22 years, would almost certainly be discovered during the cataloguing process. He turned from the window. Drax had time, Watson. Time to plan. Time to acquire the necessary poison. Time to forge a receipt that would implicate another person entirely. The others may have panicked when they learned of the archival project, but Drax had the luxury of methodical preparation. I asked whether he believed Drax to be the murderer. Holmes shook his head slowly. I believe Drax had motive, means, and opportunity. But I do not yet understand why he would choose to act now rather than at some earlier point. If his goal was to prevent the exposure of the misfiling, he might have killed Sir Alister at any time after learning of the cataloguing project. Why wait until the work was nearly complete? Why allow the danger to approach so close before taking action? Perhaps, I suggested, he hoped the document would not be found. Holmes considered this. Possible, but unlikely. A man who murders to prevent exposure does not gamble on the possibility that exposure might not occur. He acts to ensure it cannot occur. He returned to the table and gathered the notes he had made during the interviews. We are missing something, Watson. Some element that transforms this from a crime of prevention into a crime of, he paused, searching for the precise word, retribution. The afternoon had worn into early evening, and the dinner gong sounded from the hall below. Holmes straightened his coat and assumed that expression of polite disengagement he employed when among those he suspected of murder. We descended together, and I carried with me the growing conviction that Holmes was approaching some revelation, though its precise nature remained obscured. The interviews had established facts, had confirmed suspicions, had narrowed the field of possibility. But they had not yet yielded the single clear answer that would transform investigation into certainty. That answer, I suspected, would come soon. But it would not come easily, and it would not come without cost. Chapter 7. The Theory That Almost Stood. Inspector Lestrade arrived at breakfast the following morning with the air of a man who has spent a sleepless night in productive labour, and emerged with results worthy of the effort. He requested a private conference with Holmes, and we withdrew to the same small study where the previous day's interviews had been conducted. The inspector settled into his chair with visible satisfaction, and withdrew from his coat pocket a notebook whose pages bore evidence of considerable recent use. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I believe I have assembled a case of sufficient coherence to warrant an arrest." Holmes inclined his head in that gesture of polite attention I had learned to recognise as indicating neither agreement nor disagreement. "Pray continue, Inspector." Lestrade consulted his notes with the deliberation of a man preparing to present evidence before a magistrate. The facts, he said, arranged themselves thus. Miss Eugenia Pemberton Vane is the principal heir to an estate worth in excess of £20,000. She had both motive and opportunity to administer the poison. But beyond these obvious considerations, I have discovered evidence of a more specific and damning character. He turned a page of his notebook with a flourish that suggested he had been rehearsing this presentation. Miss Eugenia, he continued, was aware of some unnamed secret concerning her uncle's past. I have this morning interviewed the housekeeper at length, and she reports that approximately 3 weeks ago she observed Miss Eugenia emerging from her uncle's study at an unusual hour, carrying papers which she returned to their place when she noticed the housekeeper's presence. Holmes made no comment, but I observed that his attention had sharpened perceptibly. Furthermore, Lestrade continued, I have discovered a notation in Miss Eugenia's personal diary, which I obtained this morning with the consent of the magistrate. The entry is dated the 10th of October, 5 days before Sir Alister's death, and reads as follows. The matter must be concluded before the archivist finishes his work. The inspector looked up from his notes with an expression of triumph. The matter, Mr. Holmes? What matter could she mean except the secret she had discovered in her uncle's papers? And what conclusion could she intend except the permanent silencing of the one person who might reveal that secret? He laid his notebook upon the table with finality. When we combine this with the forged receipt for prussic acid, the handwriting similarities, and the clear financial motive, I believe we have grounds not merely for suspicion but for arrest and prosecution. I confess that even I, who had witnessed Holmes's investigation and understood something of the deeper history underlying the crime, found Lestrade's case disturbingly persuasive. The circumstantial evidence arranged itself into a pattern of such apparent coherence that to reject it seemed to require deliberate perversity. Holmes remained silent for what seemed a considerable time. When he finally spoke, his tone carried an unusual quality of respect. Inspector, your case is admirably constructed. You have assembled facts with diligence and arranged them with logic. I can find no fault with your reasoning given the evidence you have chosen to emphasize. Lestrade's expression of satisfaction deepened. Then you concur with my conclusions. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the window, his habitual refuge during moments requiring delicate phrasing. I concur, he said slowly, that your theory accounts for the observable facts. What I cannot concur with is the assumption that accounting for facts is equivalent to identifying truth. The inspector's satisfaction dimmed somewhat. I am not certain I follow your meaning, Mr. Holmes. Holmes turned from the window. Tell me, Inspector, when you examined Sir Alister's study on the morning of the murder, did you observe the condition of the fireplace implements? Lestrade consulted his notebook with visible puzzlement. The fire tools. I noted them in my general survey of the room. They appeared unremarkable. Holmes's gaze moved for just a moment, and I followed the direction of his glance to recall the detail I had not consciously registered at the time. In my mind's eye I saw again the study as it had appeared that terrible morning, and I recalled now what Holmes had observed then, that one of the iron fire tools, the poker I believed, had been recently and imperfectly cleaned, its surface bearing faint traces of some substance that had been scrubbed away but not entirely removed. I must ask you, Inspector, Holmes continued, to grant me 24 hours before proceeding with any arrest. I am not, as you know, entirely satisfied with the geometry of this matter, and I believe that an additional day of inquiry will either confirm your theory beyond question or reveal certain complications that may require its modification. Lestrade frowned, clearly torn between the desire to act upon his conclusions and the recognition that Holmes's requests, however cryptic, had proven worthy of consideration in the past. I can grant you until tomorrow morning, he said finally, but if no material evidence emerges to contradict my findings, I shall proceed with the arrest of Miss Eugenia Pemberton Vane. Holmes thanked him with genuine courtesy, and the inspector departed to continue his documentation of the case, leaving us alone in the study. I asked Holmes directly what he had observed about the fire tools that bore upon the investigation. He did not answer immediately, but instead withdrew from his pocket a small lens and moved toward the door. "Come, Watson," he said, "I require your medical expertise for a matter of some delicacy." I followed him, mystified, as he descended to the main hall and requested of the housekeeper permission to examine Sir Alister's study once more. She granted it with the weary resignation of one who has ceased to question the peculiar requests of investigating gentlemen, and Holmes entered the room with an intensity of purpose I had seldom observed. He moved directly to the fireplace and knelt before the set of iron implements standing in their brass holder. Using his lens, he examined each tool in turn, paying particular attention to the poker. After perhaps 2 minutes of this scrutiny, he withdrew a small envelope from his waistcoat and, with infinite care, scraped a minute quantity of some residue from the poker's surface into the envelope, which he sealed and placed in his pocket. He then rose and turned his attention to the folder of papers that still lay upon Sir Alister's desk, now under the protection of official seals placed by Lestrade. Holmes examined these seals with care, noted their position, and then, with a deftness that bordered on prestidigitation, lifted the edge of one seal just sufficiently to slide a single sheet of paper partially free without disturbing the seal's integrity. What he observed upon that paper I could not see from my position near the door, but I saw his expression undergo a subtle transformation, a settling of features that suggested the confirmation of some hypothesis he had already formed. He replaced the paper with equal care, near ensuring the seal remained unbroken, and gestured for me to follow him from the room. We returned to our own chambers, and only when the door was securely closed did Holmes produce the envelope containing the residue he had scraped from the poker. He held it to the light, examining the minute particles with his lens, and then passed both envelope and lens to me. "Tell me, Watson, what you observe." I examined the residue as carefully as my less practised eye permitted. The particles appeared to be a mixture of ash and some other substance that had been burned but not entirely consumed. There was a faint chemical odour, acrid and unpleasant, that I could not immediately identify. "I believe," I said slowly, "that someone has burned papers in that fireplace and has used the poker to ensure their complete destruction. The residue you have collected is what remained despite those efforts." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And the chemical odour you detect is consistent with the burning of documents that have been treated with certain fixatives used in legal copying processes. Someone burned papers from Sir Alister's folder, Watson, and burned them after his death. Not before. But why would the murderer burn evidence?" Holmes seated himself and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "That, Watson, is the question that has troubled me since I first observed the imperfectly cleaned poker. If Miss Eugenia murdered her uncle to prevent the exposure of some secret contained in those papers, why would she then burn a portion of those papers? The burning suggests not concealment of the secret, but rather its selective destruction, the removal of some specific document while leaving others intact. I struggle to follow the implications. Then you believe Miss Eugenia is innocent." "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that Lestrade's theory is elegant, coherent, and very nearly correct. It fails only in one particular. It identifies the wrong suspect. The diary notation Miss Eugenia made about concluding a matter before the archivist finished his work refers not to her uncle's murder, but to something entirely mundane, a disputed drainage easement on the southern boundary of the estate that required resolution before the autumn rains made the land impassable for survey. You have verified this. I have verified it through examination of the estate's legal correspondence, which Lestrade did not think to review with the same care he applied to more dramatic evidence. The matter in question is documented in letters between Miss Eugenia and the neighbouring landowner, letters whose dates correspond exactly to the diary entry and the prussic acid receipt." Holmes withdrew from his pocket a second envelope, this one containing the receipt Lestrade had produced as evidence. "The handwriting," he said, "bears superficial similarities to Miss Eugenia's script, because it was deliberately modelled upon a letter of hers that the true purchaser had seen and retained for precisely this purpose. The forger was skilled, but not quite skilled enough. There are certain formations, particular loops and crosses, that reveal the hand is imitating rather than writing naturally." I asked him who he believed to be the forger. He did not answer directly. Instead, he rose and moved once more to the window, that station from which he conducted his most serious reasoning. "Tomorrow, Watson, I shall demonstrate to Lestrade the invalidity of his theory in each of its particulars. I shall show him that the diary notation is innocent, that the handwriting is forged, and that the burning of papers occurred after the murder as part of the murderer's effort to remove evidence not of Sir Alister's old crime, but of his own recent one. and you know who the murderer is." Holmes turned from the window, and I saw in his face an expression of grim certainty. "I know who the murderer is, Watson. What I am still determining is precisely how to prove it in a manner that will satisfy both justice and the law." The afternoon passed in a state of suspended anticipation. Holmes withdrew to conduct what he termed final verifications, and they're leaving me to occupy myself as best I could. I walked the grounds, attempted to read, and found my thoughts returning repeatedly to the image of that imperfectly cleaned poker, and to the question of what papers had been burned and why. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. Lestrade, satisfied that he had solved the case, ate with good appetite and spoke of returning to London once the formalities of arrest were complete. Miss Eugenia maintained her usual composure, though I fancied I detected in her eyes an awareness that she stood under suspicion, and a determination not to display the fear such knowledge might reasonably inspire. It was only as we rose from the table that Holmes spoke to me in an undertone that carried unusual urgency. "Tomorrow, Watson. Tomorrow we shall see whether truth can overcome the considerable gravity of circumstantial evidence arranged in the service of a plausible falsehood." Chapter 8. The Invalidation. Holmes was already dressed when I rose the following morning, standing at the window with that quality of coiled readiness I had observed in him before moments of decisive action. He greeted me with unusual brevity and announced that we would breakfast in our rooms rather than descend to join the household. He required, he said, a final hour of uninterrupted thought before commencing what he termed the invalidation. I asked him what precisely he intended to invalidate. "Everything, Watson," he replied. "Every assumption, every inference, every carefully constructed edifice of circumstantial evidence that Lestrade has assembled. I shall demonstrate that his theory, for all its surface coherence, rests upon foundations of sand." He spoke with such quiet certainty that I did not doubt him, though I confess I could not yet perceive how he intended to accomplish this dismantling. We descended at 9 o'clock to find Lestrade already in conference with the local magistrate, preparing the documents necessary for Miss Eugenia's arrest. Holmes requested a brief postponement, explaining that he had discovered certain matters bearing upon the case that required immediate attention. Lestrade, with visible reluctance, agreed to delay the proceedings until noon. Holmes's first investigation concerned the diary notation that had so impressed Lestrade as evidence of guilty knowledge. He requested access to Miss Eugenia's personal papers, which Lestrade had retained as evidence, and spent perhaps 20 minutes examining not merely the diary entry in question, but the surrounding pages, the correspondence filed nearby, and a sheaf of legal documents pertaining to estate management. When he emerged from this examination, he carried with him 3 items: the diary, a letter dated the 8th of October from a Mr. Cornelius Blackwell of the neighbouring property, and a surveyor's report dated the 12th of October regarding disputed boundary markers. He laid these before Lestrade with the methodical precision of a man constructing an argument from primary sources. "Inspector, I invite you to read the diary entry in its full context rather than in isolation." Lestrade read, his expression gradually shifting from confidence to uncertainty. The diary entry, when examined alongside the dates of the surrounding entries, clearly referred to ongoing estate business. The entry immediately preceding it mentioned the drainage dispute. The entry following it recorded a meeting with the surveyor. The matter to be concluded was not, as Lestrade had assumed, her uncle's murder, but rather the resolution of a boundary disagreement before seasonal rains made the disputed land inaccessible for proper survey. Holmes then directed Lestrade's attention to the letter from Mr. Blackwell, which referenced the same dispute and urged its swift resolution, and to the surveyor's report, which documented the conclusion of the matter on the date Miss Eugenia had specified. The inspector set down the documents with an expression I can only describe as chastened. "I concede, Mr. Holmes, that the diary entry admits of an innocent interpretation, but the handwriting evidence remains." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Indeed, Inspector, let us turn our attention to that matter." His second investigation took us to the chemist's establishment in Holborn, where the prussic acid had been purchased. This required a journey to London by the morning train, and both Lestrade and I accompanied Holmes, the inspector with increasing unease, and I with mounting curiosity as to what Holmes intended to demonstrate. The chemist, a Mr. Reginald Phipps, was a small, precise man who kept meticulous records and possessed a memory for customers that bordered on the remarkable. He produced his ledger at Holmes's request and indicated the entry for the purchase in question, made on the 3rd of September under the name E. Pemberton. Holmes examined the signature with care, then produced from his pocket several examples of Miss Eugenia's genuine handwriting, obtained from the estate correspondence. He laid these beside the signature in the ledger, and invited both Mr. Phipps and Inspector Lestrade to compare them. The similarities were indeed present, as Lestrade had noted, but Holmes directed our attention to certain specifics: the formation of the capital E, the crossing of the letter T, the particular loop of the letter B. In Miss Eugenia's authentic writing, these formations were consistent, executed with the unconscious automatism of habitual script. In the ledger signature, they were studied, deliberate, the work of someone attempting to reproduce observed characteristics rather than writing naturally. Mr. Phipps, Holmes said, "I wonder if you might recall the customer who made this purchase?" The chemist consulted his ledger once more. "A woman," he said, "middle-aged, respectably dressed. She wore a veil, which I noted at the time as unusual but not unprecedented for ladies purchasing chemicals for photographic work." Holmes thanked him and asked one further question. "Did the customer speak to you, or did she merely present a written request for the materials?" "She spoke very little," Mr. Phipps replied. "She had a written list of requirements and pointed to what she needed rather than asking for it by name. I remember thinking at the time that she seemed nervous, though that is not uncommon among ladies making purchases of this nature." We departed the chemist's shop with Lestrade in a state of visible perturbation. The veiled woman, Mr. Holmes. "You believe it was not Miss Eugenia?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that it was someone disguised to appear as Miss Eugenia might appear, someone who had studied her handwriting sufficiently to forge a plausible signature, and someone who deliberately avoided extensive conversation that might reveal a voice the chemist could later identify." "But who," Lestrade asked, "would go to such elaborate lengths to implicate an innocent woman?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he consulted his watch and announced that we must return to Ashgrove immediately, as he had one final demonstration to conduct before the matter could be considered fully resolved. We arrived at the Grange shortly after 3 o'clock to find the household in a state of suspended tension. Holmes requested that all members of the company assemble in the library, and when they had done so, he asked Mr. Sayers a question that appeared to have no connection to anything that had preceded it. "Mr. Sayers, when you were engaged to catalogue Sir Alister's archive, who informed you of the commission?" The archivist consulted his professional diary. "The engagement came through the firm of Marchmont and Gray, legal agents in London. They contacted me in February of this year regarding the scope of the project." "And did you discuss this engagement with anyone before arriving at Ashgrove?" "Only with my professional colleagues," Mr. Sass replied. "It is customary to mention such commissions in our field, as they often lead to referrals for similar work." Holmes turned to address the assembled company. "Inspector Lestrade has determined, through inquiry with the firm of Marchmont and Gray, that the cataloguing project was arranged through the recommendation of a solicitor whose client had recently passed away, and whose estate included similar archival materials requiring professional attention. That solicitor was Mr. Edmund Drax of Gray's Inn." A silence descended upon the room. Reverend Drax, who had been standing near the window, became very still. Holmes continued with inexorable precision. Mr. Edmund Drax was the brother of Reverend Octavius Drax, and he managed certain legal affairs for his late brother Thomas Crail during Thomas's residence in Madeira. When the cataloguing project was commissioned in February, Mr. Edmund Drax would naturally have mentioned it to his brother the Reverend, who would thus have known 8 months before any other person in this household. or that Sir Alister's archive would be subjected to systematic examination. Reverend Drax made no response, but his hands, I observed, had begun to tremble. Holmes moved to the table where he had laid certain documents prepared in advance of this confrontation. 8 months, he said quietly, is ample time to acquire prussic acid under a false name. 8 months is ample time to study the handwriting of another person sufficiently to forge a plausible signature. 8 months is ample time to plan a murder with such care that suspicion would fall upon others, while the true perpetrator remained above suspicion. He paused, allowing the weight of these observations to settle upon the company. Inspector Lestrade has been pursuing a case of inheritance and financial motive, but the true motive in this matter is neither inheritance nor money. It is something far older and far more corrosive. It is grief transformed over 2 decades into grievance, and grievance calcified into something that required only sufficient practical occasion to become murder. Reverend Drax's composure had begun to fracture visibly. His clerical collar seemed suddenly too tight, and he raised one hand to loosen it with a gesture that struck me as unconscious. Holmes produced from his pocket the envelope containing the residue he had scraped from the fire poker. Papers were burned in Sir Alister's study after his death, he said. Not by Miss Eugenia, who discovered the body and had no opportunity to destroy evidence before summoning assistance. Not by Mr. Holt, who was demonstrably in his chamber when the body was found, but by someone who had access to the study in the brief interval between Sir Alister's death and the household's awakening. Someone who knew that a specific document in that folder would, once examined, reveal not merely the misfiling of 1873, but also certain annotations made by Thomas Crail himself. Annotations that would demonstrate his brother Octavius had knowledge of the conspiracy and had benefited from it. He set down the envelope with finality. That document, carefully burned and its ashes dispersed, is gone. But its absence is itself a form of evidence, as is the residue remaining upon the poker used to ensure its complete destruction. The silence that followed this declaration was absolute. Every eye in the room was fixed upon Reverend Drax, whose face had become the colour of old parchment. Lestrade, recovering from his astonishment, stepped forward. Reverend Drax, I must ask you to accompany me for formal questioning regarding the murder of Sir Alister Pemberton Vane. Drax did not move. His gaze was fixed upon some point beyond the visible room, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. My brother died in poverty and disgrace, he said. They promised to save him, and they merely postponed his reckoning. The misfiling did not protect him. It condemned him to 20 years of exile and fear. Holmes regarded him with an expression I could not immediately interpret, something between pity and clinical interest. Your brother's fate was not Sir Alister's doing, he said quietly. Thomas Crail made his own choices. The misfiling gave him an opportunity he might have used differently. That he squandered it is no one's responsibility but his own. Drax's hands, still trembling, clenched into fists. You did not know him. You did not see what that knowledge did to him, living always with the fear of discovery, unable to return home, dying unmourned in a foreign land. Holmes made no reply. Lestrade, with professional efficiency, repeated his request that Drax accompany him. The Reverend rose with the mechanical movements of an automaton and allowed himself to be led from the room. I remained standing long after the others had dispersed, conscious that I had witnessed not merely the solution of a murder, but the final chapter of a tragedy that had begun long before any of us were born. Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Library. The evening following Reverend Drax's removal brought with it a quality of exhausted relief, as though the house itself had been holding its breath and could at last release it. Yet Holmes appeared unsatisfied, restless in a manner I had learned to recognise as indicating unfinished business. He spent the better part of the afternoon in solitary contemplation, smoking his pipe with such intensity that our sitting-room became nearly uninhabitable, and responding to my inquiries with monosyllables that discouraged further conversation. It was only as the dinner hour approached that he emerged from this abstraction and announced his intention to assemble the remaining members of the household for what he termed a complete accounting. Inspector Lestrade, he said, had removed the murderer but had not explained the murder, and justice, however mechanical its application, deserved to be founded upon understanding rather than mere arrest and conviction. I asked him whether such an explanation was necessary now that the guilty party had been identified. He fixed me with a look of mild reproach. Watson, a crime of this complexity does not resolve itself into simplicity merely because handcuffs have been applied. There are questions that remain unanswered, implications that have not been articulated, and persons who deserve to know the full truth of what occurred and why. We assembled in Sir Alister's library at 8 o'clock. The choice of location was Holmes's, and I understood it to be deliberate. It was here that the archive boxes sat, here that the misfiled record had first crossed Holmes's hands, here that the deeper history of the crime was most physically present. The room had been prepared with additional lamps, and the autumn darkness pressing against the windows served to focus our attention inward, creating an atmosphere of enforced intimacy. Present were Miss Eugenia, composed as ever, but with a visible lightening of the burden she had carried since her uncle's death. Mr. Holt, subdued and considerably aged by recent events, sat apart from the others with the air of a man who has survived an ordeal, but recognises that consequences remain to be faced. Mr. Sass occupied a chair near his cataloguing materials, his professional detachment intact, but his curiosity evident. Inspector Lestrade had been invited and had accepted, though he stood rather than sat, his notebook at the ready in the manner of one recording testimony, rather than receiving explanation. Holmes positioned himself before the fireplace, not from any desire for theatrical effect, but because it afforded a position from which he could address the entire company without turning. He began without preamble, in the measured, almost clinical tone he reserved for explanations he considered too serious for embellishment. "You have all been living," he said, "within the shadow of a crime committed 22 years ago. Some of you were aware of it. Others suspected its existence without knowing its particulars. One among you has paid with his life for it, and another will face the gallows for a murder that was, in its essence, a delayed consequence of that original transgression." He paused, allowing this observation to settle. In the spring of 1873, Thomas Edward Crail stood accused before the Exeter Assizes of fraudulent conversion of trust funds. The evidence against him was substantial, the prosecution prepared, and conviction was all but certain. Yet the case never proceeded to trial. The indictment was misfiled in such a manner that it could not be located when required, the prosecution could not proceed without it, and the case was eventually dismissed for want of evidence. Thomas Crail departed England and lived for 18 years in Madeira, dying there in 1891 without ever having faced justice for his crimes. Holmes moved to the table where the archive boxes stood and rested one hand upon them. The misfiling was not accidental. It was accomplished through the deliberate action of two men who had access to the court records, and who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to remove a document from its proper sequence and place it where it would not be found during the ordinary conduct of legal business. Those two men were Sir Alister Pemberton Vane and Mr. Crispin Holt. Mr. Holt made a sound that might have been protest or merely exhalation. He did not rise, did not speak, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair with such force that his knuckles whitened. Holmes continued without acknowledging the reaction. "The question that has occupied my attention is not whether this misfiling occurred. The evidence for it is conclusive, but why men of professional standing and considerable reputation would risk everything to enable a criminal's escape. What was Thomas Crail to them that they would commit such an act?" He withdrew from his pocket a slip of paper covered with notes in his own distinctive hand. "I have spent the past 2 days in correspondence with various parties acquainted with the principles involved. I have learned that Thomas Crail was not merely a stranger to Sir Alister and Mr. Holt. He was the natural son of Sir Alister's elder sister, a woman who had died in childbirth under circumstances that brought considerable shame upon the family. Thomas was raised in obscurity. supported by family funds but never acknowledged, never granted the name or position his birth might otherwise have afforded. Miss Eugenia drew in her breath sharply. I observed that this intelligence was entirely new to her. Sir Alister, Holmes continued, felt responsibility for his nephew, though that relationship could never be publicly admitted. When Thomas fell into criminal activity, Sir Alister faced an impossible choice: allow him to be convicted and bring further disgrace upon the family, or find some means to spare him the consequences of his actions. He chose the latter, and he enlisted Mr. Holt, his friend and colleague, to assist in the scheme. Holmes turned to address Holt directly. You agreed, I believe, not from any personal connection to Thomas Crail, but from loyalty to Sir Alister, and from a belief that one act of mercy might redeem a young man who had lost his way. Is that not so? Holt's voice, when it came, was scarcely above a whisper. We thought we were saving him. We thought if he could begin anew, free from the stain of conviction, he might make something of himself. We were wrong. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment. You were indeed wrong. Thomas Crail took the freedom you gave him and squandered it. He lived in Madeira under constant fear of exposure, unable to build a legitimate life, dying at last unmourned and unredeemed. Your act of mercy merely prolonged his suffering and ensured that he died as he had lived, a failure and a fugitive. The silence that followed this observation was profound. I found myself thinking of Sir Alister alone in his study at midnight, reviewing the documents that recorded his failed attempt at salvation. Holmes resumed his narrative. Thomas Crail had a younger brother, Octavius, who entered the church and took the name Drax to distance himself from his brother's disgrace. Octavius was aware of the misfiling, and may indeed have benefited from family funds that would otherwise have been consumed by Thomas's legal defence. When Thomas died in 1891, Octavius was left with a burden of grief and, more dangerously, a conviction that his brother had been betrayed by the very men who claimed to be saving him. He moved to the window, that habitual station from which he conducted his most serious reasoning. For 20 years that conviction festered. Octavius Drax became a man consumed by a grievance he could neither articulate nor abandon. He blamed Sir Alister not for the misfiling itself, but for the particular manner in which it was accomplished. A manner that gave Thomas temporary freedom but permanent exile, that spared him prison but condemned him to a life of fear and diminished circumstance. When Reverend Drax learned, 8 months ago, that Sir Alister's archive would be catalogued, he recognised that the misfiled indictment would almost certainly be discovered. He saw not danger, but opportunity. The threatened exposure that would terrify the others provided him with perfect cover for an act of revenge he had contemplated for 2 decades. Holmes turned from the window to face the company. The murder was planned with meticulous care. Reverend Drax purchased prussic acid under a false name, forging Miss Eugenia's signature to create a trail of evidence that would implicate her. He knew the household routines, knew when Sir Alister took his nightly brandy, knew when the poison could be introduced without risk of immediate discovery. He killed Sir Alister not to prevent exposure of the misfiling, but to punish the man he held responsible for his brother's wasted life. And the burned papers, Lestrade interjected. What were they? Holmes produced the envelope containing the residue from the poker. I believe they were documents in Thomas Crail's own hand, possibly letters written to his brother Octavius during his years in Madeira, documents that would have revealed Octavius's knowledge of and possible complicity in the original conspiracy. Reverend Drax could not risk their discovery during the investigation of the murder. He burned them in the hours immediately following Sir Alister's death before the household was awakened. Miss Eugenia spoke for the first time, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of something that might have been anger or grief. My uncle carried this secret for 22 years. He lived with the knowledge that his attempt to save his nephew had failed utterly, and he was murdered for it by a man who blamed him for a failure that was not truly his to own. Holmes regarded her with an expression of profound sympathy. Your uncle made a choice that violated his professional oath and his duty to justice. But he made it from a motive that, however misguided, was rooted in human compassion. He attempted to save a young man who could not be saved. That the attempt failed does not make it less worthy of understanding, if not of forgiveness. Mr. Holt rose unsteadily from his chair. "I suppose," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I shall face charges for my part in the misfiling." Holmes exchanged a glance with Lestrade. The inspector cleared his throat. "The misfiling occurred 22 years ago, Mr. Holt. The relevant statutes of limitation have long since expired. Moreover, the principal evidence of the crime was destroyed by Reverend Drax when he burned those documents. What remains is insufficient to support a prosecution, even if the Crown were inclined to pursue one." Holt sat down heavily, as though his legs would no longer support him. "Then I am free." "Legally, yes," Holmes said quietly, "but I suspect you will carry the weight of this matter for the remainder of your days, as Sir Alister carried it. Freedom from prosecution is not the same as freedom from consequence." The gathering dissolved shortly thereafter. Miss Eugenia departed with her composure intact, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. Mr. Holt withdrew to his chamber, a man considerably diminished by the revelations. Mr. Sars expressed polite gratitude for the explanation, and returned to his cataloguing with the detachment of one whose professional obligations transcended personal drama. Lestrade remained behind to exchange a few final words with Holmes. "You have done remarkable work, Mr. Holmes," he said with genuine respect, "though I confess I'm still not entirely certain how you knew to focus upon Reverend Drax when all the evidence appeared to point toward Miss Eugenia." Holmes smiled faintly. "The evidence pointed where it was directed, Inspector. When evidence arranges itself too neatly, when it answers every question before the questions are properly asked, one should suspect not the hand of fate, but the hand of design. Reverend Drax constructed a case against Miss Eugenia with considerable skill. His error was in constructing it too well, in anticipating objections and addressing them before they arose. True evidence accumulates organically with gaps and contradictions. False evidence is too complete, too coherent. It tells a story rather than suggesting one." Lestrade nodded slowly, absorbing this principle. "I shall remember that, Mr. Holmes." The inspector departed, leaving Holmes and me alone in the library. The lamps were burning low, and the archive boxes cast long shadows across the floor. Holmes moved among them one final time as though taking leave of old acquaintances. "It is finished, Watson," he said quietly. "The past does not sleep, but at least now it has been properly interred." Chapter 10. What Time Preserves. We departed Ashgrove Grange on a Tuesday morning in late October. I am at the countryside, lying beneath a sky of unbroken grey that threatened rain but did not deliver it. The trap that conveyed us to the station moved along roads already carpeted with fallen leaves, and I observed that the landscape, which had appeared merely autumnal upon our arrival, now suggested something closer to winter's approach, as though the events of the past week had accelerated the season's progress. Holmes occupied the journey to the station in silence, his gaze fixed upon the passing fields with an abstraction I did not disturb. It was only as we settled into our railway carriage, the train beginning its slow passage through the Berkshire countryside toward London, that he spoke at all, and then only to remark that he would be pleased to return to Baker Street and the problems of the present rather than those of the past. I observed that the case had been resolved with considerable success. He turned from the window with an expression I could not immediately interpret. Success, Watson, is a word that sits uneasily upon a case of this character. We have identified a murderer, yes. We have prevented the conviction of an innocent woman. We have clarified the historical record and exposed a conspiracy that has lain dormant for more than 2 decades. But what have we actually accomplished beyond the mechanical application of justice to a tragedy that was already complete before we arrived? I suggested that justice, however mechanical, was itself no small accomplishment. He made no reply, but returned his gaze to the window, and I knew better than to press the matter further. The subsequent legal proceedings unfolded with that slow, a grinding inevitability characteristic of English jurisprudence. Reverend Octavius Drax was tried at the autumn assizes on a charge of wilful murder. The evidence assembled by Holmes and Lestrade proved sufficient to secure a conviction, though Drax himself offered no defence beyond a statement, brief and without emotion, that he had acted to right a wrong that the law had failed to address. The jury required less than 2 hours to return a verdict of guilty, and the sentence was pronounced with the formal gravity befitting so serious a matter. I attended the trial at Holmes's request, though he himself declined to be present for any portion of the proceedings save his own testimony. I observed Drax throughout and was struck by the peculiar quality of his demeanour. He appeared neither defiant nor repentant, but rather indifferent, as though the trial concerned someone else entirely, and he was merely a spectator to his own fate. When the sentence was read, he received it with no visible reaction save a slight inclination of his head, as one might acknowledge a piece of information already known. Holmes, when I reported these observations to him, remarked only that men who commit murder for reasons of grievance rather than gain often display such detachment. They have already lived through the emotional crisis that led them to kill. The trial and its consequences are merely administrative matters, the final settling of accounts they balanced in their own minds long before. Mr. Crispin Holt faced separate proceedings arising from the misfiling of 1873, though these proved to be of a considerably lesser character than he had feared. The matter was raised before a disciplinary committee of the bar, which heard evidence regarding his role in the conspiracy, and deliberated for several days before issuing a formal censure, but declining to recommend disbarment. The committee's published findings acknowledged that the offence was serious, but noted that it had occurred more than 2 decades previous, that Holt had practised with distinction in the intervening years, and that the principal architect of the scheme, Sir Alistair, was beyond the reach of earthly judgment. Holt accepted the censure with what appeared to be genuine relief, and retired from active practice shortly thereafter. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had removed to the continent, where he lived quietly and was not known to have discussed the Ashgrove affair with anyone. Miss Eugenia Pemberton Vane administered her uncle's estate with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed in life, and if the revelations regarding Sir Alistair's illegitimate nephew caused her distress, she did not permit it to show. The estate was settled, debts were paid, and certain charitable bequests were honoured with a promptness that suggested she wished to conclude the matter as expeditiously as possible. She wrote to Holmes once, a brief letter of thanks for his intervention and for his discretion in handling certain sensitive aspects of the case. Holmes read the letter, filed it without comment, and never referred to it again. Mr. Leopold Sayers completed his catalogue of Sir Alistair's archive with Teutonic thoroughness. The final product, delivered some months after our departure from Ashgrove, ran to 3 volumes and was considered by those competent to judge such matters to be a model of its kind. The misfiled indictment of Thomas Edward Crail was duly noted in the catalogue, with a corrective annotation explaining its original position, its subsequent displacement, and its eventual recovery. The case of Regina versus Thomas Edward Crail was closed 22 years late, anticlimactically, in a footnote. The Exeter County Records Office acknowledged receipt of the corrective documentation and filed it in the appropriate sequence. Thomas Crail's name was added to the register of cases resolved by death of the accused prior to trial, and the machinery of record-keeping moved on to other matters, indifferent to the human cost of the clerical error it had finally corrected. It was perhaps 3 months after our return to Baker Street that Holmes received a final communication relating to the case. It came in the form of a letter from the chaplain who had attended Reverend Drax in the days preceding his execution. The chaplain wrote that Drax had declined spiritual counsel, but had asked that a message be conveyed to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The message was brief, and to my mind deeply disturbing in its implications. "Tell Mr. Holmes," Drax had said, "that he was correct in his reasoning but incomplete in his understanding. I did not kill Sir Alistair because I blamed him for my brother's suffering. I killed him because the misfiling did not fail. It succeeded exactly as intended. My brother was never meant to be saved. He was meant to be removed. And the misfiling ensured he could never return to claim what was rightfully his. Sir Alister paid at last for a crime of calculation rather than mercy. Holmes read this message twice, then placed it in the file he maintained on the case, and closed the folder with an air of finality. I asked him what he made of Drax's claim. He was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that gesture of deep contemplation I knew so well. If Drax spoke truly, Watson, then we have solved only half the mystery. We identified the murderer and understood his motive as he permitted us to understand it. But the original crime, the misfiling itself, may have been something darker than an act of misguided compassion. Then you believe Sir Alister intended to exile his nephew permanently rather than save him? Holmes shook his head slowly. I believe we shall never know with certainty. Sir Alister is dead, Holt will not speak, and Thomas Crail cannot testify to what he was promised, or what he understood. Drax's final message may be truth, or it may be the last attempt of a condemned man to poison the memory of the one he murdered. We have only the facts we can verify, and those facts support either interpretation. He rose and moved to the window, that habitual station from which he had conducted so much of his reasoning during the case. The past does not surrender all its secrets, Watson. We excavate what we can, we reconstruct what the evidence permits, but there are always depths we cannot reach, motivations we cannot fully penetrate. We have solved the murder of Sir Alister Pemberton Vane. Whether we have understood the man himself is another matter entirely. I recorded these reflections in my notebook, conscious that they represented not merely the conclusion of a case, but Holmes's acknowledgement of the limitations inherent in even the most thorough investigation. Some truths, I understood, remained forever beyond recovery, buried not in misfiled documents, but in the hearts of men who carry their secrets to the grave. The weeks passed, and the Ashgrove affair receded into that collection of cases I maintained for possible future publication. Holmes returned to his usual occupations, the problems of the present claiming his attention with their customary insistence. Yet I observed that he kept the file on the misfiled indictment case near to hand rather than consigning it to the archives, as though he expected some further development or insight that might illuminate the questions that remained. It was on a grey afternoon in December, as we sat before the fire in Baker Street, that Holmes made his final observation on the matter. We had been reading in companionable silence, the kind of silence that long association renders comfortable rather than oppressive, when he set aside his volume and spoke without preamble. You know, Watson, what troubles me most about the Ashgrove case is not what we discovered, but what we preserved. By solving Sir Alister's murder, we have ensured that his attempt to save or exile his nephew, whichever it was, will be remembered. By exposing the misfiling, we have guaranteed that Thomas Crail's name will remain associated with fraud and failure. By bringing Reverend Drax to justice, we have confirmed that grief and grievance, given sufficient time, will calcify into something indistinguishable from malice. He paused, his gaze fixed on the flames. The past does not sleep, Watson. It merely waits for someone careless enough to go looking. And when we find it, we discover that time preserves not truth but fragments, not understanding but ambiguity, not resolution but the perpetuation of questions we lack the means to answer. I closed my own book and regarded my friend across the hearth. Yet we brought a murderer to justice, I said. Surely that counts for something. Holmes smiled faintly, a smile without warmth, but not without a certain grim satisfaction. It counts for everything and nothing, Watson. Everything, because justice, however imperfect, is the only tool we possess to impose order upon chaos. Nothing, because the imposition of order does not eliminate the chaos. It merely contains it, files it, and marks it closed in the official record. He rose and placed another log upon the fire, though the room was already adequately warm. We did our work, Watson. We did it thoroughly and I believe correctly. But I should be lying if I claim to feel the satisfaction I once derived from such conclusions. The older I become, the more I understand that every case we close is also a story we end, and not all stories deserve the endings we give them. With that observation, he returned to his chair and his book, and we spoke no more of the matter. The fire burned low, the December darkness gathered beyond our windows, and the city outside continued its ceaseless movement, old indifferent to the small dramas of justice and consequence that occupied our attention. I set down my pen now, many years after these events, and find myself returning to Holmes's final words on the case. The past does not sleep, it waits, and when we disturb it, we discover that what time preserves is not always what we hope to find, and what we preserve by our investigations is not always worthy of preservation. Yet we investigate nonetheless, because the alternative is to permit murder to go unpunished, secrets to remain buried, and the dead to cry out unheard from their graves. This is the work we have chosen, Holmes and I, and if it yields more ambiguity than certainty, more questions than answers, it remains work worth doing. The case of the misfiled indictment record is closed. The file rests in its proper place among the others, and somewhere in the archives of the Exeter County Records Office, a notation in a catalogue records the correction of an error made 22 years previous, a small amendment to history that cost 2 lives, and exposed secrets that might better have remained undisturbed. Whether we served justice or merely satisfied curiosity is a question I leave to others to determine. We did what we could with what we knew, and that perhaps is all that can be asked of any investigation, however thorough its methods or ambiguous its conclusions.